All right, welcome to the Real Crusades History Podcast. My name is J. Stephen Roberts, and I'm joined by regular Real Crusades History staffer Scott Amos today. Scott, how are you doing?
I'm fine, Stephen.
Great. And we are joined by two very special guests. Regular on here is Dr. Helena Schrader. Dr. Schrader, welcome. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well today. Glad to be back.
Excellent. And for the first time, we've got somebody new with us, and that is Dr. Steve Donnachie. Steve, how are you doing today?
I'm very well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Great. We're so glad to have you with us. So, Dr. Donnachie, since this is the first time we're having you, why don't you sort of tell everybody where you teach and sort of some of your interests?
Okay. I'm occasionally employed by Swansea University to teach on undergraduate courses, medieval history, early modern history, that sort of thing. My area of research tends to be on sort of the late 12th and early 13th century Kingdom of Jerusalem, political, economic, social history, that sort of thing. I've been working on it for many years. Worked under John France, my supervisor, very influential on my work. That's what I've been doing, really.
Great. So, some seriously legit stuff right there in terms of Crusades history, and right in the area we tend to focus on with this podcast. So today our subject is, I'm pretty excited about this. Dr. Schrader and I have been working our way through, we did the Battle of Hatin, and then we looked at the fall of Jerusalem in 1187. So now we're going to actually kind of get into the Third Crusade, and we're going to kind of talk about some of the preliminary aspects of the Third Crusade. We're going to touch on the response in Europe, how Crusading responded to this disaster of the Battle of Hatin and the fall of Jerusalem. And we're also going to look at some of the initial military actions of the Third Crusade. So I kind of wanted to start off. This is just a little quote from a book that I think is really great, God's War by Christopher Tyreman. And this is just a little blurb he has about, just to kind of introduce our subject, about sort of what was going on in Christendom once this happened. So he says, news of Hatin reached the west by rumor, letter, and messenger. While Saladin was gathering in the shattered remains of the kingdom, the Archbishop of Tyre set off to the west, arriving first in Sicily, where King William II immediately dispatched a fleet of about 50 ships with 200 knights. The disaster produced profound shock. Pope Urban III reputedly died on hearing it. Even before the full extent of Saladin's conquests became known, a response began to be organized. In November 1187, Richard, eldest surviving son of Henry II of England, became the first ruler north of the Alps to take the cross. In late October, the new Pope, Gregory VIII, issued a bull, authorizing a general expedition to the east and summarizing the privileges offered to those who took the cross. After 40 years of complacency, indifference, and lip service, Christendom's response to Gregory's call was overwhelming.
Can I just start by saying, I think that, and Steve, I'd be really interested in your opinion on this since we haven't had a chance to talk in advance, but I think one of the key issues to keep in mind here is that it was a shock in Western Europe, although Baldwin IV had made multiple appeals to Western Europe for support. He had sent the keys of the kingdom and the keys to the Tower of David and the Holy Sepulchre to the west, essentially offering the kingdom to whichever ruler would come east and pick up his burden. He was trying to, of course, to avoid Guy of Lusignan taking over. But you have a situation where Baldwin IV and his barons are aware of the situation. They can see Saladin gaining strength. They know what situation they're in, and they make the appeal to the West, and they're ignored. Why is that? They are ignored until it's too late, and I'm going to throw out the thesis, because they had been too successful in defeating Saladin for the last 10 years. You have the victory at Montgesard. You have this leper king consistently beating off Saladin and his attempts to his earlier invasions, so that you had this sort of crying wolf phenomena going on in the West. And that's why the fall of Jerusalem came as such a huge shock. I don't know, Steve, if you have anything you want to add to that.
I'd very much agree with that. No, you're quite correct. For decades, the Latin East, Baldwin IV, his father Amalric, Baldwin III, had been sending missions, envoys to the courts of the Latin West, to the kings of France, to the German emperors, to the papacy, to the kings of England, pleading, asking for help, asking for money, asking for that they come and help them. And
Yeah.
of course, from the perspective of these Western magnates, these Western courts, that everything seems to be going okay in the Latin East. I mean, they don't seem to be having too much trouble, and obviously, people like the Count of Flanders, head out and or Henry the Lion, go out and on their own personal crusades and participate. But there's I imagine that there's this kind of mood that everything from a distance seems quite all right, and this is just a formality. Oh no, the Franks and the Latin East are here again, begging for help and money, but everything seems fine. But of course, to the Franks and Latin East, who are there on the ground, who can see things a lot more closely in much more detail, they know the nuanced differences between what's actually going on. That okay, they're keeping Saladin at bay, but they're very much aware that with the since the rise of Nur al-Din and Saladin, that things are getting darker and getting harder for them, and they're not going to be able to last forever.
They can see Saladin gaining power.
But you beat them at Montgisard. You held off Saladin in 1183. What's the problem?
Yeah.
Was there an idea too that God was going to protect Jerusalem? Like no matter what happened, God wasn't going to allow Jerusalem to fall. I know I've heard that idea floated around here and there.
Yes, very much so.
Well, you say very much so. I think that might have been a more an attitude among common people, but as you say, there was a steady flow of noblemen who continued to go out. In fact, Hugh de Lusignan, the father of Guy and Amory, dies in the East. You mentioned Flanders, you mentioned others. People did continue to come on crusade, did continue to go out as armed pilgrims. So I don't think there was a total sense of we don't have to do anything. That's an interesting question, but I think that maybe at deep-seated belief that it can't really fall.
Well, did some of this have roots in the results of the Second Crusade? I mean, the failure, an indifference, or a hostility to the idea of things in the Latin East, the situation there. Was there any influence there at the time we're speaking of?
I think you have to assume there is some. The disappointment that they went out, they made this, the East made this appeal after the fall of Edessa. They send out the king, and what did they achieve? Nothing. So there certainly is a sense of, well, it's a risky business. So if I go out there, they're asking again, I could go out there and find out the situation isn't really what I thought it was, and I could come back not covered with glory, and but basically discredit it. So there was maybe more of a risk. People started to be more calculating than they would have been before, at least on the part of the rulers. Steve?
No, very much so. There's this legacy of things didn't go very well last time, and it's within living memory for many of the participants. Certainly people like Reynald de Chatillon, for example, were aware of what has occurred, what went wrong, and that in the Latin West there was the idea that there's this legacy. Well, if you're going to commit, then you've got to know what you're doing, and you've got to have plans, you've got to have ideas. It didn't work out as well as maybe they'd hoped, despite all of the pomp and ceremony and everything put forward for advancing the Second Crusade, where after the fall of Edessa, a lot of effort for very little gain. And why, if you're a monarch in the Latin West and all you can see is the Kingdom of Jerusalem seems to be managing well enough without you, why take on that risk? Go to that effort if it isn't really necessary. Of course, it is necessary, but they realize that too late, only once Jerusalem has fallen.
Well, I guess I've just gotten the idea there's this whole general sense of apathy in Western Europe after the Second Crusade, or that developed after the Second Crusade. What was the attitude of the average man in the street?
I think that's overstating it, Scott. As I say, because you do see you see people continuing to come east, whether it's Flanders with quite a large army. I'm blanking out on other names, but actually there's a continuous flow of mini crusades or mini armed pilgrimages. So there can't have been complete apathy.
Yeah.
Hugh de Lusignan, as I say. And in terms of normal people, again, there's a constant flow of pilgrims to the east. People still see it as a major, as the ultimate pilgrimage, and they are not indifferent to the fate of Jerusalem.
Okay.
That-
Well,
and-
that's kind of the idea that I wanted to clear up, Helena. That the the idea that there was just Western Europe fell into this just sense of apathy or disinterest, but you're telling me that's not the case. So
Right.
And I think that the greatest evidence is the reaction after the fall of Jerusalem. There couldn't have been this huge wild response after the fall of Jerusalem if people were indifferent to it.
right.
Which you do see after the fall of Acre. I mean, you don't see any sort of a response in the same scale when the kingdom of Jerusalem finally falls in the late 13th century.
I'm going to go ahead and ask Dr. Donnachie. What do you think was once Jerusalem had fallen to Saladin and once that news was becoming widely known in Western Europe, what do you think was the response of just the average person? Not necessarily the kings and the Pope, but
man in the street sort of.
Sure, yeah.
To a certain extent, shock. Maybe not as profound profound, maybe more in some ways than the reaction of maybe kings and magnates and things like that. In that they'd had grown up in a century of with Jerusalem and the Holy Land in Christian hands, able to travel there, and Jerusalem was once more part of the Christian world, part of Christendom, and that it suddenly has been taken away, that everything is imperiled by Saladin's success. Must throw everything sort of into upside down. The world has been turned upside down for them. Everything's topsy-turvy. What does this mean? How can this have been happened? How could this have occurred? What does it mean for them? What is this? There's ideas of the end of times and apocalypticism and things like that. What's going to happen now? What do they do? And obviously, for the magnates in power who've had decades of these envoys and ambassadors turning up, in some regards, I mean, they might be shocked, but on the other hand, they shouldn't really have been surprised, since they'd been recipients of these embassies year after year and had only done so much, or hadn't done maybe enough. Maybe their shock is more that they'd waited too long, or they hadn't. The shame of not having done enough.
A certain amount of guilt complex.
Guilt complex, yeah.
But I couldn't agree.
Only after the fact do they go, oh yes, well, what do we do now?
And I'd like to add that, these crusading armies were not feudal armies. This was not something where a lord could say, you all have to show up at X time. They were volunteers. Everybody who went on crusade did so of their own free will. And it would have been impossible for the kings or nobles to raise a crusading army, certainly not the size that they did for the Third Crusade, if they hadn't had popular support.
Do you think there was kind of, we're talking about the issue of there was not enough of a reaction during the period when they could have done more, when Jerusalem was still in Christian hands. Then after Jerusalem falls and everything falls for the most part, then there's this huge reaction. Does that sort of reflect kind of a disconnect between, what were the more practical strategic goals of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which was like any territory, it needs to have border integrity, it needs to be able to expand into regions that can be securely held. It needs to not be vulnerable to invading armies, versus just what generally was the concern of most Christians throughout Western Europe, was okay, we want to have Jerusalem. We want Jerusalem there to be available for us to just come, show up, and worship and venerate the Holy Sepulchre. And I think, you mentioned earlier the Count of Flanders, and I think that was in the 1170s he shows up, and he has he has an army with him, but as I understand it,
Yes.
he doesn't really involve himself in that big of a push to accomplish anything militarily. I might be wrong about that, but he seemed...
That's a complicated story. Because
Okay, sure.
That was when King Alaric was trying to invade Egypt.
Right.
And he basically thought if his troops were going to be used to invade Egypt, he ought to get the lion's share, like become king of Egypt. And the Byzantine emperor, which was providing the fleet, and King Baldwin, who was the king of Jerusalem, felt that no, he shouldn't become king of Egypt, that Egypt should then become part of the Kingdom of Jerusalem or part of the Byzantine Empire, but that he shouldn't become king. So there was this disconnect between what do we do if we're successful, like trying to divide up the spoils before we had them, because then they end up not invading Egypt at all. And Flanders is engaged in a campaign in the north when Saladin takes advantage of the fact that he's already collected his troops on the southern border, and he invades the Kingdom of Jerusalem from the south when it's practically undefensible, which is why you have Baldwin, rushing down to try to protect Ascalon with just, 376 knights.
So maybe there's kind of like a misconception there, that the idea that, the Count of Flanders wasn't really that interested in doing anything. It's just that there was a difference of opinion militarily.
It was about, what
goals.
to do. Yeah.
Okay.
But your initial point, I'm 100% behind you, which saying is that there's most people, and that's logical, most people today, most people at any time, have their own individual lives and their own individual goals. And for them, it was about, as you're saying, being able to have that Jerusalem should be Christian, and it should be a place that they could go as pilgrims without being at risk to their lives. But they didn't think as military leaders or even as political leaders. That was the job of those who held those positions and benefited and profited. As we would say today, people, that's way above my pay grade.
Mm-hmm.
If you, I'm not going to worry about how to defend these places. That's what the knights are for. That's what the militias are for. That's not my job.
The sort of idea that people, turn up on, the personal crusade, individual actions, and they do their bit, and when they've done their bit, and they feel they've contributed enough, and redeemed their vows, that they can depart. Of course, the locals are the ones left holding the having to hold, deal with the situation, the aftermath, and having to make what best possible strategic gains can we make from what has just elapsed or what has just occurred. What benefit can we derive from this? Sometimes that could be a lot, and other times that could be very little. But they've got to do something.
Dr. Donnachie, let me go ahead and ask you this. What do you think about the reaction of the King of England and the King of France in particular?
Henry II in England. Well, at one point, I imagine he'd be rather irate on the matter in that he'd spent an awful lot of money being sent to the Latin East, and doesn't really seem to have worked out. All this money that he'd sent, and Jerusalem has fallen, and the kingdom has been all but destroyed. And on the other hand, the kings of Jerusalem are a cadet house of Anjou.
Absolutely.
There's got, and even in following from Richard as well, I imagine there's be a sort of level of personal, familial loyalty that while my cousins, after all they are cousins, are in danger. That there is a threat. It is not only my duty as a Christian and as a king to protect the holy places and protect the borders of Christendom and things like that, but it's my duty that I've got to oversee the interests of my family, my house, and so I think there's a mixture of his personal family pride and as much as there is sort of piety, and this is an expected part of being a Christian king in the Middle Ages. This is what has to be done.
And Steve, would you? Sorry. While we stay on England, would you agree that Henry is often portrayed in history books as not being interested in the Crusades and being too intelligent to get bogged down into things like that, whereas I think when you really look at his record, he was far more interested in Jerusalem than you might think from the fact that he never went there. Mm-hmm. But that in fact his problems with France and with his sons prevent him from doing what his grandfather had done, which was at a later stage in life go to Jerusalem.
Oh no, very much so. Troubles at home are much more immediate than theoretical troubles far away, and need to be dealt with first. Can he really go to the Holy Land? Can he really intervene in foreign affairs unless he's dealt with problems at home first? And no, it's not really. No, he can't. He has to be secure in his own kingdom. Those are his primary concerns, and those that are certainly the most overwhelming concerns. But he must have had, some kind of care to an extent. I mean, it must have been quite an important issue to him. Otherwise, why would he have paid so much money over so many years?
Exactly.
And as I say, I think he showed genuine interest. They talk about when the patriarch goes and makes the appeal for him or one of his sons to come out in 83, was that, or 84?
83, 84, yes.
Yeah. He, the indications are he actually was very tempted. It was just that his hands are tied by the rebellions of his sons.
Yeah, so there's this image of John piping up to pick me, I'll go, I'll do it, I'll be king of Jerusalem, which if nothing else would be a very interesting what if of alternative history if John had ended up being king of Jerusalem. France, by comparison, I mean, this is the same thing because Philip II, Augustus, and everything, by comparison to Henry II and Richard, just seems much more aloof on the matter. Bit harder to nail down. Henry seems like okay, the Jerusalem has fallen, something has to be done, and when Richard takes over, Richard is very keen on getting something done as soon as possible. And Philip II, no, I mean he seems a bit reluctant all the way through. Even when he gets there, he spends a brief amount of time there, and as soon as Acre's recaptured, he's happy to return, and which is odd. I mean, it stands in quite contrast to his father, Louis VII, of course, in the Second Crusade, and his noted piety. I think maybe more of the criticisms that are labelled at Henry II might be more accurately labelled towards Philip II.
Yeah, absolutely.
Being too smart. I mean, Philip is, if the career of Philip II certainly shows that he's quite a smooth political operator. If anyone sort of deserves that sort of criticism as being too smart for their own good, I think it's probably more Philip than it was Henry or Richard.
Absolutely.
Prince Richard at this point. What do you think about his reaction to the fall of Jerusalem?
I think it's genuine. I mean, everything, when you look at Richard's, what he does and how much he risks and does almost lose his kingdom, I think what you have is someone who's genuinely fired up by the idea that this is something that has to be done and that they have to save Jerusalem. I'm not going to consider myself an expert on Richard. I know more than the average layman who's read several biographies, but everything I've read suggests that he was very pious. He was someone who took, Christianity and Catholicism seriously. That doesn't mean he didn't sin. Doesn't mean he wasn't Saint Louis, but I think he was seriously concerned about the loss of Jerusalem and concerned about it falling into infidel hands or pagan hands, and was sincere in wanting to rescue it. Steve, what about you?
Yeah,
More cynical as an Englishman?
He's one of the first to take up the cross. He hears that Jerusalem has fallen, and nothing stops him. He's not. He takes up the cross. He pledges to go and save it while he's still the Count of Poitou, and I think his responses are quite genuine. There might also be this sort of idea that Richard has grown up in sort of Aquitaine and has noted for his musical and abilities and things like that, patron of troubadours, and Aquitaine obviously noted for such things. And he's a warrior, and what do the Crusades offer but the sort of the ultimate chance of glory and songs and things like that, of living the sort of
the Holy Grail
that you'd heard about for the men of the First Crusade. Here it is served up right in front of you. And if Richard really is this sort of warrior that he loves fighting and all that sort of thing, if that's really one of the things in the forefront of his mind, the ideal opportunity has presented itself. So as much as he has his personal piety, which I don't particularly doubt, the great opportunity to make a name for himself is presented there and then. And how can he say no?
Yeah, and I think that piety and the warrior spirit were really wrapped up in each other in that culture of Southern French songs. I mean, this is we were talking about kind of at the height of the Crusades era. I mean, he would have grown up with songs that were all about Crusaders, I'm sure.
I mean, it's in the Fourth Crusade that the same sort of thing happens. There's a tournament in Champagne, and the Fourth Crusade is preached, and all these knights who have been listening to songs and tournaments of the previous Crusaders all take up arms. I can't see it. The same sort of thing may have happened very much for Richard and his circle in Aquitaine.
I think we're also talking about the same period where you're starting getting the Holy Grail legends. And so the idea of going to Jerusalem to prove your knighthood is part of that absolute chivalric ideal. Chivalry is harnessed to the defense of Christianity. And it's at this period. That's not true 100 years earlier during the First Crusade in the same way.
The idea of Christian knighthood had just completely, it was an institution by then.
Yeah, as opposed to the First Crusade era.
As opposed to the time of the First Crusade. I mean, it had become chivalry. These institutional aspects of knighthood had developed that just weren't around at the time of the First Crusade.
The Siege of Tyre by Saladin. So this is kind of a crucial moment in the Third Crusade. So I've got this little passage here from Ibn al-Athir. And he says, if Saladin had attacked it first, that being Tyre, he would have taken it easily. But he thought that its natural defenses would make it difficult to capture, and wanted first to secure its surrounding territories. So that's kind of... Ibn al-Athir is an interesting Muslim source because he was not necessarily beholden to Saladin. And he tends to be a little bit critical of Saladin sometimes. But I think there's kind of two things he's saying in there, that are almost kind of contradictory. It's like, on the one hand, maybe he should have tried to take Tyre first. On the other hand, it's pretty hard to take Tyre. So
I think, Ibn al-Athir, has obviously the benefit of hindsight, writing many, many years after the fact, and by then it is clearly apparent that the error, the big mistake, that for Saladin was not taking Tyre, not taking this one city that would provide the beachhead for all crusading reinforcements to come in, and everything that followed as a result. And Tyre is a tough nut to crack. I mean, it took quite a long time in the early 12th century, 2 attempts for the Crusaders to take it. It is a very defendable city, a very defendable position, so long as it has access to the sea with fleets and things like that. But I'm not sure if how hard it would have been for Saladin at the very beginning. That if he'd gone straight, he stuck with the Siege of Tyre rather than choosing to go to Jerusalem, that it would have been as easy. I mean, there's talk in the Leon Anul text that Reynald of Sidon was, negotiating with Saladin while he was in charge of the city after Hatin, and was willing to surrender it and putting his banners up and all. And then Conrad of Montferrat comes along and stops all of that and tells Reynald to get out. But that sort of thing doesn't really seem to crop up much elsewhere. Reynald then goes off to hold out Beaufort for a good long while as well, at his castle of Beaufort. So I'm not sure if it would have been as easy as maybe Ibn al-Athir thinks it would have been earlier on. That it's the city is defendable, and as long as the populace has the will to resist, then it wouldn't have been a walkover in any sense of the words. And while some have sort of demonized Reynald of Sidon there, I don't think that really is maybe the case, because certainly Conrad has him quite close and as an advisor in the years afterwards.
I agree entirely. I think that, as you say, with hindsight, it might have been easier then because people were still in shock. But the reality is, you still had the survivors from Hatin do go to Tyre. So Ibn and Sidon are both there at the beginning. You have, as you say, a defensible city, and you have a population that knows what the alternative is.
Certainly, I mean, you don't really need a vast military force. You
Right.
hear these things like there were, in Jerusalem there are 60,000 defenders or something when Saladin turns up. Obviously, that's not 60,000 fighting men, fighting troops, military, combatants.
Nope.
But it is people to whom
Refugees.
refugees
50 women and children for every man.
But if you can, can be pressed to defend the city, especially when the option is, being put to the sword or sold into slavery, and you don't need to be a fighting man or a knight or a sergeant or anything like that to adequately defend a city or look after a city wall. And more so in Tyre, it's out on the coast. It's defended on 3 sides by water, and you need an adequate navy to invest it. And the problem that Saladin has, of course, is that you've got all these Italian mercantile communities with all their ships constantly arriving in the Latin East, using Tyre as a harbour. He's got a navy, but so do the defenders.
And at this time, the Christian ships were actually better in terms of nautical design. They were generally better than that of the Arab countries. Or Saladin's fleet, they were better manned at the time. Basically, the Christians ruled the Mediterranean at this period, except when Saladin could concentrate his forces very effectively. And that fact of that sea is also critical for the psychology. The problem with Jerusalem was there was no relieving army. There was no way they were ever going to be rescued. So that the fight in Jerusalem is a fight to martyrdom. It's defending the holy city because it's the holy city. But in Tyre, you're only holding out until the help from the west comes that you believe will come. And you've sent out your archbishop. He's already on the waves. You know he's on his way to Sicily and Rome. You expect support. So there's much more motivation for holding out at Tyre than there was at Jerusalem itself, although, as we say, they still put up a remarkable defense.
This is the thing about Saladin, is that the first, the opportunity to take Tyre was the best opportunity there and then. But he's not a fool. I mean, he knows that the longer he leaves it, the greater the likelihood of a crusading force turning up that will start throwing the military equation against him. The longer he leaves it, he knows the harder it will be. He knows he's got to do it quickly. He knows it's what he has to do. The sensible military thing for him to do is to capture Tyre and thereby deny as much of the Palestinian coastline to any relief attempt by future crusaders. He knows that's going to be the case. He's well aware of it, but he chooses not to do it. He chooses to go for Jerusalem in the end and give up on Tyre and everything.
Yes, but there may also be a reason why he did that, because he also knew that he had to keep his troops happy too. And long sieges are not ways that you keep troops happy. Plunder, easy victories and plunder is how you keep your army in the field happy. So he had the same problem.
Is a confederation. He's had to build it up from all these different entities that he's managed to conquer or subdue or coerce into assisting him, and that's not easy to do. People want to go off home. They want to go back to their homes. They want to go tend their fields. Especially as the colder weather and winter approaches. After you get past October. They don't want to be out in November and December and January, sort of besieging, these godforsaken cities as far as they're concerned.
Which is why when he does lay siege to Tyre, he comes back again at the end of December. He fails. He fails, and it's not as though he just didn't stick to it in the beginning. He does come back in December of 1187 after taking Jerusalem, and it's a close run thing. The Christians do actually fight him off, but mainly because his army's breaking up and Saladin can't keep them in the field.
Yeah,
it's a morale issue.
As I understand it too, there was some pretty impressive, like you were saying, Dr. Schrader, there was some impressive fighting on the Christian side.
Yeah, and that's the point is that the Christians actually use a ruse. In other words, they pretend to be disintegrating and like they're going to try to break out, and the Saladin's fleet takes the bait. They lower the chain as if they're all going to try to get out. Saladin's ships rush in to kill them and are then themselves overwhelmed and barely get. Some of them escape and have to beach themselves just outside. But he basically loses his entire fleet.
Right.
And then if they had not been able to fight off Saladin's ships, having let them into the harbor, that was a soft underbelly. There was no defenses. If Saladin's fleet had overwhelmed the Christian ships in the harbor and then gone ashore, there was no more defense. They would have taken the city from the back. It was very risky, and I don't think a commander does that unless they were also in a fairly desperate situation. So I think you can assume that Tyre was fairly close to collapse when they used that ruse, and they were very lucky. Steve?
Yeah, no, quite the case. It is a desperate move. I mean, the sea is the one thing that they can depend upon, the defenders of Tyre can depend upon. And if they've lost access to it, it's only a matter of time. All Saladin has to do is maintain his blockade. As long as they can maintain that lifeline, there's always the hope that more forces will come, and they do come. The King of Sicily sends troops. Early in 1188, the fleets of the Pisans and the Genoese turn up.
And then the Frisians and the Danes.
That's exactly what they were hoping for. But in that sort of last quarter of 1187, after Jerusalem has fallen. It's all sort of, everything's on the table. They're playing for keeps.
and particularly since the Mediterranean's basically closed in the winter. So it's actually, as I say, the arrival of the Sicilian fleet is the first fleet that could get in, but they couldn't expect anything from the west in December and January because of the storms in the Mediterranean.
And the only real advantage, I suppose, they've got is that any fleet that Saladin then has to summon from Egypt, from his bases in Egypt,
Yeah.
is going to take quite some time to traverse up the Palestinian coast, past Ascalon, all the way up to Tyre, against the currents, against the winds, in not the most opportune time of the year for sailing. So long as they can keep his ships that are already out and about in the area at bay, or delay them, or neutralize them somehow,
Yeah.
more time passes, and the possibility of their success, that they can hold out, that they can be saved by a crusade, increases exponentially.
Look, I think maybe we should make a little comment about Montferrat himself, because he's sort of been turned into an enemy in very much, at least he's been
Quite central to the
vilified.
affairs, really. But
He's kind of to me, he's kind of an example of how frequently these rather opportunistic individuals were beneficial to the cause of the Crusades, where more pious men failed.
That's an interesting way of looking at it.
Not always the case, but you compare
but-
somebody like Conrad of Montferrat to like maybe a Louis IX or Louis VII, and
Particularly
it's interesting that Conrad has, quite a sort of negative reputation as, in the history of the Crusades, and I mean, this may in part because of his opposition to, the Richard I, the Lionheart, this glorious character, fighting Saladin and everything. As far as a nice, convenient narrative and story goes, and he can be this sort of, bogeyman in the corner, causing trouble. But, he's actually quite popular in sort of, romances. I mean, Bertrand Le Borgne and stuff is, sing songs praising his virtues and, his defense of Tyre and his timely intervention. Close to the time, he's not got as perhaps this negative image, and it's something that's grown up as part of the, sort of the mythos of the Third Crusade and, the Lionheart and all that sort of thing.
And I'm going to say that it's even a bit of an English bias, because I think you look at German sources of the Crusades, who obviously, the great Richard the Lionheart has the fight with the Duke of Austria. He then gets imprisoned by the Holy Roman Emperor. There's considerable hostility in English chronicles against the Holy Roman Empire, whereas Conrad is definitely, a noble from that empire. And I think, as you say, that also fits into that the British view of Conrad as he's the opponent of Richard. He's, of course, the counter king to Guy of Lusignan, who's Richard's vassal. But as I say, and I would like to just point out, he also isn't a nobody. There's a lot of the sense of that, he's just some sort of a random, adventurer. He's not. He's first cousin to Friedrich Barbarossa. He's first cousin to Louis VII of France. He's a nephew to Leopold of Austria. He's Sibylla's first husband's brother. This man does have ties to the ruling families of Europe, and he has ties to Jerusalem.
He's exceedingly well connected. He's, sort of, first rank sort of nobility for the Latin West, not a name or a person that should be, instantly dismissed. I think so. The idea that because he has this good fortune to, leave Constantinople, arrive in Acre, realize that there's some sort of trick going on, and turn up in Tyre in the nick of time to save the city from Saladin, and everything, that there's a kind of Johnny-come-lately, opportunistic, self-interested parvenu sort of figure, which I don't think is entirely true. I mean, yes, he is sort of one of these aristocratic diaspora individuals that seek to expand across the Mediterranean. That with nothing new. The Lusignans had done that, but I think it's just the sort of a convenient narrative that's been manipulated, that he's this character that fulfills a set role, regardless of. Well, he does save Tyre. He is central to stiffening resistance in Tyre, against Saladin, at a critical juncture, and the city is saved. I mean, he is there, he is doing that, he is organising the defence, he is rallying the barons about him. And if you look at the charters that he issues in the period of time, the Balian of Ibelins there, Reynald of Sidon, the three stepsons of Raymond of Tripoli, the Tiberius brothers, they're all there. The barons, who've escaped Hatin or have been released, are all gathered about him and willing to serve. That shouldn't be underplayed.
Nope.
But he's got this bad reputation that grows up afterwards, comes from sort of this Anglo-centric historiography. that he's the opponent's, this ne'er-do-well that opposes the Lionheart, and that's not on.
Yep.
He's obviously a very competent military man. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, he's operates in the Byzantine Empire in the years prior. He's serving Isaac II, and he's he puts down revolts and rebellions against the Byzantine Empire. He's experienced. He's a knowledgeable fellow. He knows what he's doing. He's not a poor choice of commander.
Right.
Sort of leader that would have been beneficial to the Kingdom of Jerusalem at this time. And as we all know, I mean, Richard did ultimately commit to him as the king prior to his assassination. So.
Exactly.
Did you have anything to add to that, Dr. Schrader?
No, I think that was very well summed up, and I think I would only add that also in the Holy Roman Empire, he had also fought with his father and brothers. I mean, he had a long history he had a long, successful military career before he arrives at Tyre.
Right, exactly. So, Saladin, he fails to capture Tyre, and that's obviously going to become very important in the course of the Third Crusade. Another thing that happens is that Guy of Lusignan rallies a group around him to begin the Siege of Acre. And Ernol says, actually has some positive things to say about this. He says, great was the faith of God's people, in that so few dared to undertake so great a deed as laying siege to Acre. For there were so many Saracens within the city that there was scarcely one Christian for every 10 of them. And he doesn't really emphasize Guy's role in that, but that's what I kind of want to ask the two of you about is what do you think of Guy of Lusignan's involvement in this? And another issue I want to address later is why was Saladin unable to break this siege up that went on for so long, even before the kings of Europe arrived?
Who wants to go first here?
You can go first by all means.
Two things about, was it Guy's decision or was it Geoffrey de Lusignan's decision? That's an interesting one. I think the chronicles raise that it was his brother Geoffrey who convinces him, and Amory, who's a very competent military man and turns out to be a much better king of Jerusalem, who are the ones who probably convinced Guy that he shouldn't just give in and and do nothing. But that since Conrad de Montferrat doesn't allow him to Tyre, absolutely calls him the former king and is not willing to let him in. And we're going to say this isn't just Tyre. Conrad de Montferrat, as you mentioned just earlier, the barons of Jerusalem are backing Montferrat on this. They don't come out rallying to Guy de Lusignan. He's lost the kingdom. He's lost Hatin. He's totally discredited. So Guy's there outside with Sibylla and his two daughters, apparently, who are children. And the way it's described in the chronicles is that it's his two brothers that talk him into trying to do something.
Right. And
not just admitting this. So I don't think this is an example of Guy suddenly becoming decisive and different than he has been. I think this is a matter of him being under the influence of stronger characters, namely his brothers. The decision to lie siege to Acre seems to me totally absurd. But at the same time, it was maybe under stronger influences in terms of decisiveness, but it certainly wasn't a more intelligent, strategic, or tactical move than anything else Guy has ever done in his entire career. Because if you were going to try to do something, he should have tried to go north and try to create a continuous French Christian country between Tyre and Beirut, which was still in the hands of Tripoli. Why on earth do you go further south, isolate yourself even farther from the rest of the Christian community? Unless, Steve, you can tell me some reason why that made sense.
I've got a couple of
ideas. Seems to me. Okay, good.
The choice of Acre, why go to Acre? It is a major port with a substantial harbour. It is a increasingly growing and prosperous city by the late 12th century. As a choice, that by itself, okay, that could be a reason. He needs a base of operations. He needs a win. He needs something to counter Conrad. Conrad's got Tyre, a major city, part of the royal domain. Guy needs something else to oppose him with. Acre. Acre's part of the royal domain. It's an important port. It has plenty of opportunities. Also, Guy has Jocelyn III, the titular Count of Edessa, in tow. Jocelyn has a huge lordship of lands and properties located just outside Acre. Additionally, in the raw domain of Acre, there are lots of cash fiefs, which barons who at that particular time were erring on the side of Conrad had lost, obviously. But if Guy captures Acre, he gains patronage over all of those lands, can possibly exert influence over part of Jocelyn's territory, and can oppose Conrad. And Pagan of Haifa's got cash fiefs in Acre, yet he's firmly in Conrad's camp. And Guy goes off there, most likely because with the advice of Geoffrey de Lusignan, who, let's not forget, he had been a very active individual in Poitou. Under Henry II and Richard the Lionheart since the 1160s. He's an experienced military commander. Likewise, his older brother Aimery, again an experienced individual, had been constable for quite some time,
and was later a very effective king.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
It's in wider strategic terms. Maybe it doesn't make sense. Yeah, going towards Beirut and Jubail. I mean, he'd started off in Tripoli when he got out from Saladin's prison in 1188 and spent many months raiding in the vicinity of Tripoli. Maybe that was his initial idea, but when when he can't compete with Conrad, he's got to have something in his hand. He's got to have something that he can challenge him with, and if he gains Acre, then perhaps he can turn those barons, the Ibelins, Reynal Saladin, and others who have properties in the city or about the city, and bring them back towards him and exert that measure of patronage. And if you look at the charters that are signed in a few months into the siege, all of those barons, the Ibelins, Reynal Saladin, the Tiberius brothers, have all departed from Conrad and Tyre and have all gone down to Acre, because it presents the best opportunity for them to reclaim some of their territory at that time.
All right, you convinced me. Although I would have still said Jaffa would have also offered some opportunities and would have been closer to Jerusalem.
It would. It's a bit further away, and its port is not as deep and as good as Acre.
Acre could be reached year round too, as I understand it. Its port was good year round.
It's got to start somewhere, and Acre is it. It seems, and that's that.
Okay.
That's the siege begins.
And I mean, Acre also is just going to be a considerably larger and more important economically more important city than some of these ports like Jaffa and Beirut. Correct.
Bigger ports, more, very much so. The thing is also that between Tyre and Acre, both offer the prospect of moving back towards the Galilee, towards places like Tiberias and Nazareth. If he's not going to go, if the idea isn't to march on Jerusalem and secure, or further down the coastline, but the idea is to build more of a rump state in the areas between Tyre and Acre, and the Galilee, which is a very rich and prosperous area in which many lords had establishments, the Ibelins, for example, all the Tiberius brothers. That is another idea, that if Jerusalem is a no-go, then the Galilee is another option. And between Tyre and Acre, you actually have that option to go elsewhere, if you should choose. I mean, they don't in the end. Obviously, the campaign is towards down the coast and towards Jerusalem, but it provides another option.
Right.
Very interesting.
Yeah, very intriguing. So, I mean, this is the beginning of the Siege of Acre is very long. I mean, it's obviously going to go into 1191 when we actually see the crusade proper arrive. But it's really interesting to me how this small Christian army was able to hold out this position, basically surrounded on all sides by the enemy. I mean, you've got Saladin besieging them from behind. You've got the Muslims attacking them from the city itself. So I guess I'll start with you, Dr. Schrader. What do you think, what was it that prevented Saladin from just sort of, exterminating this small force?
I think this is something we discussed about just earlier in the session when we were saying that pursuing a siege is not that easy if you don't have an army which is committed to the cause. And that's, at this point, Saladin didn't really have. Saladin has troops now that basically think they've won, and they want to go home and they want to take care of their own affairs, and they're really not that committed to the cause of eliminating this pesky little Christian force, which again, probably most of the Muslim leaders underestimated. I think we discussed this before. There's also, there's written records of this, Saladin complaining about the fact that even his own family is more interested in their own feuding and their own having their own victories and expanding their own power rather than helping him finish off the Christians. So that's one factor. The second factor is this isn't just Guy de Lusignan's little force that carries out the siege. It is being constantly reinforced by piecemeal, unfortunately, and it actually only fragments the force more because then you get more different leaders. You have the remnants of the German Crusade coming in. You have Danes and Pisans arriving. You have the forces under Flanders and Champagne. You have forces under the Duke of Burgundy. So you're having these various new blood coming in and filling up the places of the men who have died in the siege and have died of disease, and there's always a force, and in fact it's growing throughout the period. It's supposed to be smaller.
Yeah, there are small, like you're saying, there's small forces arriving all the time up until the large forces do arrive, and so it must have been just an incredibly grueling, brutal process. Dr. Donnachie, did you have anything to add to that?
But it's sort of like this idea of several analogies, like trying to bail out water from a sinking rowing boat or something. Saladin's got his army. He's surrounded them. He's trapped. For the most part, this crusade, this Guy's army and Crusader allies who are turning up, but he doesn't have the power or the ability to overwhelm them. And he can make attacks on them. He can attack their encampments. He can lure them out into battles. And sometimes he wins, sometimes he loses. He can attack their foraging parties and everything else. But because he can't overwhelm them, every time he succeeds at something, another ship arrives, unloads a few hundred more, and he's back to square one. And while he's trying to do this, his army is coming and going as well. It's dissipating with the seasons, and he can't hold it all together. So you just get this sort of stagnation that appears. Also, the Crusaders, the Guy and all those who turn up, are relatively committed and unified to this siege. They elect leaders amongst themselves. Henry of Champagne is elected at one point, and others like Geoffrey and Guy and James de Vances are acknowledged, for their bravery and their decisions and their wise tactical acumen. And they hold out. They build a series of fortification, ditches and fences and palisades around the Crusader encampment. And even though these are relatively modest defences by comparison to the walls and towers of the city that they're besieging, it's quite hard, to overcome them in a concentrated area. Saladin can't overcome them, so he has to rely on things like trying to starve them out. Unfortunately, he doesn't have his control of the sea is no longer secure. It's contested. So he can't starve them out, and every time he tries to, whittle them down, more boats, more ships, which he can't deal with, or can't deal with adequately or sufficiently as well, turn up and reset the situation.
So that kind of brings us to our conclusion for today. I really want to thank all of you for being here with us, and Scott and I love having Dr. Schrader, and we've really enjoyed getting to have Dr. Donnachie join us for the first time. So, Dr. Schrader, why don't you talk to us about what you've been doing lately in terms of your online presence and your blogging?
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity. I have a blog called defendingcrusaderkingdoms.blogspot.com, in which I try to weekly put out a new article on some aspect of the Crusader kingdoms, talking sometimes about the economics, sometimes about the defense, a lot of times about the individual personalities that were involved in it. It's focused more on the early part of the kingdom. I admit, I look at Steve's work, it seems more at the post-Hatin period. I focused on the first 100 years of the Crusader kingdoms, more or less. And I also have I'm working on a 3-part biographical novel of Balian de Ibelin. The first 2 volumes of that have already been released. The first is Knight of Jerusalem, which covers his life as a landless knight until he becomes Baron of Ibelin and marries the Dowager Queen of Jerusalem. And the second book, Defender of Jerusalem, covers the critical 10 years before the fall of Jerusalem, including Balian's defense of Jerusalem in 1187. Both those books are available in either ebook or as a paperback.
Yeah, great stuff. So, Dr. Donnachie, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you've been up to in terms of your research? Do you have any books planned or articles?
A couple of articles and things planned. One on the baronage of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the period after Hatin. You know, who is there? Who's actually comprising the ruling circles, and who rises to prominence, and how do matters change? You know, how ultimately does the evil and dominance of like the early 13th century come about, with all these other people, migrants arriving in the Latin East? And I've also been working on how quickly does the kingdom recover after Hatin? How quickly does its military capabilities, its military might recover? I mean, there's an idea in sort of the 13th century that the kingdom is a shadow of its former self and very weak, and everything is in constant peril, and that they're entirely dependent upon the Latin West. And I'd be great. Well, how true is that? How weak are they, if indeed they are weak at all? How quickly do their numbers recover? And are we just is that just something we've kind of invented? And is that really the case?
That's a really interesting subject. I would be really interested to hear more about that. So, all right. Great to have you guys with us. Scott, I think that's a successful podcast there. What do you think?
I think it was great, and I really appreciate your joining us, Dr. Donnachie.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, hopefully you can become a regular, just like Dr. Schrader.
Yeah, we'd like to have you back if you'd like to come.
Oh, by all means, yes.
Great. All right. Well, again, this is Real Crusades History, and we do videos on YouTube, and we also do this regular podcast. We have a new one on the every 1st and 15th of the month, so we'll be back again on the 15th.